The chandelier above the grand hall glittered with cold light, throwing fractured reflections across polished marble floors, but none of that brilliance softened the words that cut me open that night. "You're no longer welcome here, Lydia." My brother Marcus, dressed in a tailored navy suit that screamed wealth and arrogance, stood at the head of the room, champagne flute in hand, his voice echoing off vaulted ceilings. Dozens of faces turned toward me, some smirking, some whispering, most simply watching as if Betrayal were theater and they had paid for front row seats. My lungs burned. I stood frozen in my black dress, the same one I had worn just hours earlier at our father's funeral. Grief had barely begun to settle into my chest, and yet Marcus had already found the perfect moment to twist the knife. He had inherited $33 million from our father, Richard Grant, a man who built his fortune in silence and left behind a will filled with conditions that Marcus had promised to honor. Now, as the crystal clinked and expensive perfume mingled with the scent of catered hors d'oeuvres, my brother broke his promise in the cruelest way possible by erasing me in public. I heard a neighbor's gasp, sharp and cutting. A family friend shook her head. My mother, Helen, lowered her eyes, too timid, too conditioned by years of Marcus's dominance to speak. And beside him, Natalie, his fiancée, smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. A smile sharpened into a blade, as if she had been waiting for this moment of spectacle. My heart thundered so violently that I could barely hear the murmurs rippling through the crowd. They stared at me as if I were the scandal, as if my existence were the stain on Marcus's perfect inheritance. I tried to step forward to form words, but my voice betrayed me. My brother raised his glass higher, turning my humiliation into his toast. "To family," he declared, and laughter scattered across the room like broken glass. I wanted to scream that this was not family, that our father had written specific conditions forbidding him to cast me aside, that Richard had trusted me to keep our name alive when Marcus's greed burned through his fortune. But the words caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of grief, by the weight of betrayal. The images came crashing into me, nights spent scrubbing floors, while Marcus partied mornings when I skipped college classes to drive our mother to chemotherapy while Marcus slept off his hangovers. The sacrifices I had made had been invisible, unseen, unvalued. And now, in front of every guest invited to celebrate his engagement, Marcus announced my exile as if I were an intruder, as if I had no claim to the very family that had consumed my youth. My knees trembled, and I gripped the edge of a chair to steady myself. A man near the door whispered, "Is she going to cry?" His words carried enough for me to hear, and a low chuckle followed. My skin burned. The humiliation pressed down until I felt small, insignificant, discarded like the ashes of the man we had buried that morning. Marcus caught my eyes and smirked. That smirk carried every childhood cruelty, every dismissal, every golden boy privilege he had lorded over me. It was not just about inheritance. It was about power. It was about erasing me so thoroughly that even memory would not preserve my place in this family. For a moment, I thought of leaving quietly, sparing myself further disgrace. But then I remembered my father's voice weak in his hospital bed, whispering, "Take care of your brother, and if he ever forgets the truth, we'll protect you." I had not understood those words until now. The truth was still mine, hidden like a blade waiting to be drawn. Marcus thought he had destroyed me with a single sentence, but he had forgotten that conditions exist for a reason. He had forgotten that evidence never blinks. As I stood under the unforgiving light of that chandelier, my humiliation hardened into something sharper. Betrayal had ignited fury, and fury would one day become justice. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most, you know the way the air changes. It is heavy, unbreathable, filled with disbelief that someone bound to you by blood could slice you apart without hesitation. That was the weight in my chest the moment Marcus's words hung in the air. And now, as I stand before you and share this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been erased by your own family? Have you ever been told you do not belong? Not by strangers, but by those who share your last name. I know many of you watching understand what it means to carry sacrifice in silence, to give without recognition, and then to be cast aside when you expected loyalty in return. Before I continue, I want to thank you for listening. These stories are not easy to tell, but they matter because they reveal truths too many of us hide in the dark. So, if you have faced betrayal, if you have felt invisible in your own home, please share your experience in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, because this community is built on voices like yours, voices that deserve to be heard. And do not forget to subscribe, because every story I share is a reminder that justice may come late, but it always comes. I was 29 years old when Marcus cast me out, but the truth is my exile had started decades earlier in the small ways that carve themselves into a child's memory and never fade. I grew up in the same house as my brother, the same walls, the same roof, but it always felt as though we lived in two separate worlds. He was the golden boy 3 years older, with an easy smile that melted our mother's heart and a swagger that made our father laugh. I was the quiet one, the helper, the one who picked up the pieces after his storms. I can still see the kitchen table where I sat with textbooks spread wide, studying late into the night after working part-time at the diner to pay for my college classes. Marcus would burst through the door, reeking of whiskey, tossing his jacket across the room, bragging about the parties he had been invited to the girls who adored him. Our mother Helen would scold me if I sighed too loudly, as if my weariness embarrassed her, but she never once asked Marcus where he had been or why his grades had vanished into nothing. When our father Richard fell ill, I became his shadow. I drove him to treatments, filled his pill organizer, learned to read the subtle wince in his eyes when the pain clawed deeper than his words admitted. Marcus was rarely there. He would sweep into the hospital once a week, carrying expensive coffee for the nurses, flashing that grin that made people forgive him. And every time our father's face softened, as though Marcus's absence was erased by a single performance. I told myself it was fine, that being invisible gave me strength, but the truth is, it hurt. It hurt to see years of devotion drowned out by a single smile. I remember one Christmas in particular. I had saved tips for months to buy our father a wool coat, something warm for the bitter winters. I wrapped it carefully, my heart swelling with the hope he might finally see how much I cared. That morning, Marcus handed him a silver watch purchased with money he had borrowed from me and never repaid. Our father's eyes lit up at the watch, his voice trembling with pride as he declared, "Marcus, you're just like me." He tried on the coat I gave him later, thanked me, but his gaze had already drifted back to Marcus. I smiled anyway, pretending it was enough, but a part of me cracked. As I grew older, the pattern only deepened. Marcus was celebrated for achievements he never earned, while I was expected to clean up the messes he left behind. When he failed out of college, my parents whispered about how the system never understood him. When I earned my degree in accounting through night classes, barely anyone noticed. When I secured a steady job, Marcus crashed a sports car our father had bought him, and somehow I was the one lectured for being too critical. By the time our father's health declined for good, Marcus had perfected his role as the charming, careless heir, while I had become the caretaker, the background figure. My father in his final weeks began to look at me differently, as if he finally saw the truth. Once, when Marcus breezed in and left just as quickly, my father took my hand and whispered, "Lydia, you're the strong one. Don't let him forget that." I nodded, but the words felt like a strange mixture of comfort and burden. I know now that my father saw what was coming. He understood Marcus's greed, his arrogance, and he tried to build safeguards into the will. He left Marcus the fortune, but tied it with strings. Strings meant to protect me, to remind Marcus that wealth comes with responsibility. At the time, I had no idea what was written in that document. All I knew was that when the end came, I stood by my father's bed, his hand in mine, while Marcus was somewhere else, celebrating life as though death could not touch him. That was the story of our family, one child cherished for appearances, the other forgotten despite sacrifice. And though I told myself again and again that love was not a competition, the imbalance hollowed me out. Years later, when Marcus lifted his glass and erased me in front of everyone, it was not just that night's betrayal I felt. It was the weight of every Christmas, every exam, every hospital visit, every moment I had been made invisible while he was crowned the heir. The morning after our father's funeral, the air in the study was thick with silence, the kind that presses against your chest until it feels like you cannot breathe. The walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound books, the scent of old paper and cedar wood mingling with grief. Marcus lounged in a leather armchair as though it already belonged to him, one leg crossed over the other, an expensive watch glinting under the light. I sat upright on the edge of my chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to keep them from trembling. Elaine Porter, our father's longtime attorney, entered the room with a folder in her hands. She was a woman of presence, sharp suit, steady voice eyes that carried no room for nonsense. She set the folder on the desk, adjusted her glasses, and spoke with the kind of clarity that makes every word feel like a judgment. "Your father left very clear instructions in his will," Elaine began. She opened the folder, pulling out several documents. My heart pounded. I had no illusions about what would happen. Marcus had always been the favored child, the chosen heir, but some part of me still clung to the hope that our father's final words would remember me. Elaine's eyes flicked to me briefly before she turned to Marcus. "Marcus Grant is the sole beneficiary of Richard Grant's financial estate totaling $33 million. The words landed like a blow. $33 million. Even though I had known it in my bones, hearing it aloud made my breath hitch. Marcus's lips curled into a triumphant smile, and he leaned back as if a crown had been placed on his head. But Elaine continued, her voice firm enough to slice through Marcus's smirk. "This inheritance comes with conditions." The word snapped Marcus upright. He frowned, his brow creasing, his arrogance shifting into unease. Elaine read from the document. Condition 1. Marcus Grant must maintain respectful and cooperative relations with his immediate family, specifically his sister, Lydia Grant. Condition 2. Lydia Grant retains full rights to reside in the Grant family home until such time as she marries or chooses to vacate. Condition 3. Any act of exclusion, hostility, or willful mistreatment directed toward Lydia Grant will be considered a violation of the will, resulting in forfeiture of the inheritance. The room seemed to pulse with silence after her words. My throat tightened as relief and disbelief crashed against each other inside me. My father had seen me. He had known. He had not forgotten. Marcus's face darkened, his jaw tight. "You mean to tell me," he said slowly, "that my inheritance, my $33 million, depends on babysitting my sister?" His tone dripped with disdain, as if the idea of acknowledging me as family was beneath him. Elaine didn't flinch. "Those are your father's exact words. You are free to decline the inheritance if the conditions do not suit you." For a heartbeat, I thought Marcus might explode, might tear the papers from her hands and set them ablaze. But then his expression shifted. He forced a laugh, though it rang hollow. "Fine. If that's what it takes, I'll play along." I could feel his eyes on me, heavy with resentment, promising that his compliance was nothing but performance. But beneath his anger, I felt something else, fear. He had wanted the money, the status, the untouchable power that came with being Richard Grant's heir. And now that power was chained to me, the sister he had spent his life dismissing. Elaine closed the folder with finality. "Remember, Marcus, evidence never blinks. Your father's words bind this inheritance tighter than gold. Break them and the consequences will be immediate." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power return to me. My father had carved my name into the foundation of Marcus's fortune, and no amount of arrogance could erase it. Marcus might have thought he won, but I knew then that the real test had only just begun. The weeks after the will was read should have been quiet, a time for mourning, for remembering our father in peace. Instead, they became a stage for Marcus to perform his contempt. He had agreed to the conditions in front of Elaine, but behind closed doors, his patience frayed quickly and his hostility toward me sharpened like a blade. It began with small humiliations. One evening, when a group of Marcus's friends came over to the house, I walked into the living room with a tray of tea out of habit more than anything else. Marcus looked at me, then at his friends, and smirked. "Oh, don't mind her," he said loudly. "She just likes pretending she's the maid." His friends chuckled, glancing at me with the kind of detached amusement reserved for strangers. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to stay silent. Another night, I sat in the library with a book, the one space where I could feel close to our father. Marcus entered with Natalie on his arm. Her heels clicked against the hardwood, her laughter tinkling like glass. Marcus stopped, looked at me sitting there, and announced libraries off limits after dinner. "We're trying to turn this into something more useful, maybe a private lounge. You wouldn't understand Lydia. Too classy for you." He grinned, and Natalie leaned in to whisper something, her eyes cutting toward me with thinly veiled disdain. They laughed together, and the sound hollowed out the walls. Natalie's presence added fuel to Marcus's cruelty. She was polished, elegant, with the kind of confidence that comes from old money. From the first moment we met, I saw the way she measured me, her gaze sliding over my modest clothes, my quiet demeanor, the absence of sparkle in my life. She didn't need to say anything, but she often did. At dinner one night, she raised her glass and said, "Marcus, it's so generous of you to let Lydia stay here. It must be hard for her being so out of place in a house like this." The words were coated in honey, but the sting beneath them was unmistakable. Marcus laughed as though her cruelty were music to his ears. The house itself became a battlefield. Marcus redecorated rooms with lavish furniture and bold colors, erasing the warm, understated style our father had preferred. He hosted parties nearly every weekend, filling the halls with laughter and music that drowned out any memory of our father's quiet dignity. Guests spilled into the house, sipping champagne, leaving lipstick stains on crystal glasses, speaking Marcus's name as though he were royalty. And I, his sister, the daughter of the man who had built this empire, was pushed further into the shadows. At one party, he went further than ever before. The dining room table gleamed under soft candlelight filled with executives, lawyers, and Natalie's wealthy friends. Marcus stood at the head raising a toast. "To family," he said. "To carrying the Grant name with pride." He paused, his eyes locking on me. "And to keeping certain family members from embarrassing us." The table erupted with laughter. Glasses clinked. My throat closed as though I were choking. He had not just humiliated me privately. He had turned me into the evening's entertainment. My mother Helen was there that night. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast down. She said nothing, offered no defense. I wanted her to speak, to remind Marcus of the conditions, to protect me just once. But she remained silent, choosing peace over truth. Her silence was its own betrayal. One evening after another of Marcus's endless gatherings, I found myself alone in the kitchen, scrubbing wine stains from the marble counter. Natalie entered, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You know," she said softly, "Marcus feels embarrassed having you here. You're not really part of this world. It would be easier for everyone if you just left." I straightened, meeting her gaze. "This is my home too." She tilted her head, smirking. "Maybe on paper, but in reality, you're a shadow, Lydia. No one notices shadows until they get in the way of the light." Her words echoed long after she left the room. I clenched the rag in my hand until my knuckles ached. For the first time, I understood that Marcus wasn't just ignoring the conditions of our father's will. He was daring them to be tested, certain he could twist them into nothing. Natalie was his accomplice, his mirror reflecting his disdain with even sharper edges. Each insult, each dismissal, each calculated humiliation, stacked like bricks building a wall meant to keep me out. Yet within that wall, my resolve grew. For every smirk Marcus offered, I reminded myself of my father's words. "The truth will protect you." Marcus thought money made him untouchable. He thought loyalty could be bought, respect inherited. He was wrong, and though my silence gave him power for now, I knew it would not last forever. At night, when the parties ended and the halls finally fell silent, I would wander the house like a ghost. The air was heavy with the scent of spilled champagne and fading perfume remnants of a world I did not belong to. I would pass the portraits of our family that lined the staircase, my father's stern yet kind gaze, my mother's youthful smile, Marcus beaming in his school uniform, and me always slightly off to the side, my smile small, my presence muted. Even in painted memory, I had been pushed to the margins. I often found myself retreating to the study, the one room Marcus hadn't yet touched. It still smelled of cedar and ink, the way it had when my father used to sit behind the desk reviewing contracts and writing letters. Sometimes I would sit in his chair, close my eyes, and try to hear his voice again. "Lydia, you're the strong one. Don't let him forget that." Those words gave me comfort, but they also carried a weight. How could I remind Marcus of anything when he had built his life on forgetting me? I thought of all the sacrifices I had made, the years I had poured into caring for our parents. When my mother fell ill, it was me who rushed home from work to take her to her treatments, who learned how to read her prescriptions, who stayed up all night when her breathing grew shallow. Marcus had breezed in occasionally with flowers and a charming grin enough to make the nurses adore him and our mother forgive his absence. But the truth was, I had been the one who bore the burden, and when our father's health declined, it was the same. Marcus called once a week from wherever he was: ski trips, business dinners, exotic vacations. I sat by our father's bedside, read to him, held his hand as the morphine dulled his pain. I gave up promotions at work, paused my own ambitions because family was supposed to come first. That was what I believed. That was what I had been raised to believe. Yet when the time came to acknowledge those years of sacrifice, Marcus was the heir, and I was the inconvenience. Hope still flickered inside me, then fragile and persistent. My father had written those conditions for a reason. He must have believed that Marcus could change, that the weight of responsibility would humble him, that money tied to loyalty could tether him to decency. I wanted to believe it too. I wanted to believe that maybe if I endured the humiliations quietly, Marcus would soften, would remember that I was not his enemy but his sister. But each day proved me wrong. His cruelty was not a moment of grief or a lapse of temper, it was his nature. He would pass me in the hallway without acknowledgement, as if I were furniture. He would roll his eyes if I spoke at dinner, cut me off with a dismissive wave. And Natalie, her words stung sharper than his. She began leaving fashion magazines on my bed, open to articles about reinventing your image, as though mocking the plainness of my clothes. Once she suggested over cocktails that Marcus hire me as their household assistant, laughing as though it were a harmless joke. The disappointment grew heavier with each passing week. Hope became a burden, pressing down until I could barely breathe. I had thought perhaps the will would protect me, that my father's conditions would be enough to shield me. But Marcus was clever. He had mastered the art of cruelty without leaving fingerprints pushing me toward the edge, without ever crossing the visible line. He believed he was untouchable, and maybe he was right. Still late at night, sitting in the study with my father's words echoing in my memory, I clung to one truth: evidence never blinks. Marcus could laugh. Natalie could sneer, the world could look away, but one day the truth would stand taller than both of them. The night of Marcus's engagement party felt like stepping into another world, one I had never been invited to belong in. The Grant family home had been transformed into a glittering palace, chandeliers blazing with light, waiters in crisp uniforms gliding across the marble floors carrying trays of champagne. A jazz quartet played in the corner, their notes smooth and expensive, the kind of music chosen to remind everyone of wealth and refinement. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, their eyes alive with curiosity and gossip. I stood near the back of the room, my dress simple black, respectful, the same dress I had worn at our father's funeral. Around me, the air buzzed with congratulations for Marcus and Natalie. A perfect match, someone said. A true power couple. Natalie glided through the crowd with ease, her diamond ring catching the light. Her arm looped possessively through Marcus's. She was radiant, every inch the polished socialite, her smile practiced and sharp. I had no intention of stealing their spotlight, but even in the shadows I felt the weight of their eyes. Some guests nodded politely in my direction, others ignored me entirely. A few whispered behind their hands, their glances flickering with curiosity. Who was I, this woman, standing quietly on the edge of celebration? Dinner was served in the grand dining hall. The long mahogany table gleamed under soft candlelight, silver cutlery lined up like soldiers, crystal glasses shimmering with golden wine. I was seated at the far end, nearly out of sight next to a potted plant and a waiter's station. Marcus had orchestrated it, of course. I could feel his satisfaction radiating down the length of the table. As plates were cleared and the last course arrived, Marcus stood. He raised his glass, tapping it lightly with a spoon until the room hushed. All eyes turned to him. Natalie placed her hand on his arm, her smile wide and brilliant. To family, Marcus began, his voice smooth, commanding. To love, loyalty, and legacy. Guests lifted their glasses, nodding in approval. He paused, letting the moment stretch, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me. His lips curled into that familiar smirk, the one that had haunted me since childhood. Into keeping family gatherings free of embarrassment. His gaze cut through me like glass. After all, not everyone understands what it means to carry the Grant name with pride. Laughter erupted around the table, sharp and cruel. Some guests chuckled politely, unsure if they should laugh, but unwilling to stand against him. Others leaned into it, snickering openly, their eyes flicking toward me with amusement. My skin burned as though every candle in the room had been turned on me, exposing me for ridicule. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, my breath caught in my chest. I wanted to stand to scream to remind them all that our father had tied his fortune to my protection, that Marcus's inheritance was conditional, that his words were not just cruel, but dangerous. But my voice betrayed me. The humiliation pressed too heavy, and silence clamped down like iron. Natalie leaned closer to Marcus, whispering something that made him laugh louder. He raised his glass higher. "To moving forward," he said. "To leaving behind what holds us back." His eyes locked on me once more, and the laughter swelled again. I caught sight of my mother at the far side of the room. Helen sat stiffly, her lips pressed thin, her eyes cast down. She didn't speak, didn't defend me, didn't even meet my gaze. Her silence was a wound sharper than Marcus's words. The waiter standing beside me shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment on my behalf. He murmured quietly, "Do you need anything, miss?" The kindness in his tone nearly undid me. I shook my head quickly, swallowing the lump in my throat. As the toast ended and conversation resumed, I sat frozen. My father's portrait hung in the hallway just outside the dining room. I could see it faintly from where I sat, his stern eyes watching his expression unreadable. I imagined him standing there hearing Marcus's words, seeing my humiliation. Would he be proud that I stayed silent? Or furious that I allowed Marcus to spit on his conditions so openly? The rest of the evening blurred. Music swelled, glasses clinked, laughter filled the halls. Guests danced their gowns, swirling their jewels flashing under the lights. Marcus and Natalie basked in their adoration, the golden couple untouchable. And I, his sister, his equal by blood, the caretaker who had sacrificed years, was treated as though I were an intruder in my own home. I slipped out before the party ended. My steps quick, my vision blurred by tears. In the study, the only room untouched by Marcus's hand, I collapsed into the leather chair behind my father's desk. The humiliation washed over me in waves, each sharper than the last. But beneath it, something else began to stir, a quiet, dangerous resolve. Evidence never blinks. My father's words, Elaine's warning, echoed through me. Marcus thought he could humiliate me without consequence, thought he could erase me while pocketing $33 million. But humiliation has a way of hardening into something sharper than pride. In that moment, my tears dried, and I made a silent promise. I would gather the truth. I would protect my father's legacy. And Marcus would learn in the harshest light that arrogance always carries a price. The morning after the engagement party, I woke to silence. The house, usually alive with Marcus's footsteps and Natalie's laughter, was still. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting long golden lines across the floor, but the brightness did nothing to lift the weight pressing on my chest. My humiliation still echoed from the night before, replaying in my mind like a cruel recording. His words, "You're no longer welcome here," were burned into me. I sat at my father's old desk, staring at the leather blotter where he had once signed contracts, the place where his hand had trembled as he signed his will. My father had trusted Marcus to honor those conditions, but Marcus had thrown them into the fire. He thought his arrogance could erase my rights, erase me. But Elaine's words from weeks earlier returned to me like a whisper. Evidence never blinks. I dialed Elaine's office. When she answered, her voice was calm, precise. "Lydia." "Yes," I said, my voice shaking. "It happened again. Worse. He humiliated me in front of everyone last night. He's not just breaking the spirit of the will, he's destroying it." "Tell me everything she instructed." I recounted the party, the toast, the laughter, the way he had made me the spectacle of his celebration. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Elaine's voice, firm as stone. "That is a clear violation, but we will need proof. Hard proof." "Then I'll get it," I whispered. From that moment, my quiet existence in the house became something else entirely. I was no longer just a sister enduring humiliation. I was a witness gathering evidence for the truth my father had trusted would one day be revealed. I began small. Marcus, arrogant and careless, had grown used to speaking freely in his own home. I started carrying a small recorder, slipping it into my pocket whenever I was near him. It didn't take long. One evening, when a few of his friends were visiting, I overheard him in the library laughing. "The will is a joke," he said, his voice loud and clear. "All I have to do is tolerate Lydia's shadow in the house, and I'm 33 million richer. She's nothing more than a loose thread. Once Natalie and I marry, she'll be gone." My heart pounded as the words sank into the recorder, unblinking, undeniable. I saved emails too. Natalie had grown bolder in her cruelty, sending Marcus messages mocking me. One subject line read, "Your maid sister needs to go." She joked about moving me into the servants' quarters, about changing the locks once the wedding was over. I forwarded every email to Elaine, each one another brick in the case we were building. Photographs came next. At dinners, Marcus would shove my chair to the corner seat. Me next to the staff make jokes about how I fit in better there. I asked a sympathetic waiter to discreetly snap photos of the seating arrangements, and he did images showing Marcus's deliberate attempts to humiliate me publicly. The hardest piece of evidence came one night when I gathered the courage to confront him. I pressed record before stepping into the living room where he and Natalie lounged. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "You know what Father's will said." Marcus leaned forward, his smile cruel. "The will doesn't scare me, Lydia. Elaine doesn't scare me. You don't scare me. Do you really think anyone's going to take your word over mine?" Natalie laughed softly beside him, clinking her glass of wine. I held his gaze, my recorder tucked safely in my pocket. For the first time, the balance shifted. He thought his words vanished into the air, but I knew better. Words spoken cannot be taken back, not when the evidence listens, not when evidence never blinks. By the time I left the room, my hands were trembling, but my resolve had never been steadier. The humiliation he had piled onto me for months was no longer just pain, it was proof. And proof, unlike Marcus's arrogance, cannot be erased. The courthouse loomed like stone judgment itself, its gray pillars stretching high into the autumn sky. I had never felt smaller than I did walking up those steps, but I had also never felt more determined. My heels clicked against the concrete, each step echoing like a vow. Marcus was already there, surrounded by his entourage of attorneys. His suit pressed to perfection, his jaw tight, but his smile still sharp. Natalie trailed behind him, dressed immaculately, though her eyes darted nervously at the cameras stationed outside. Reporters shouted questions. Rumors had already begun to swirl about the Grant family inheritance dispute, but Marcus waved them off with practiced charm. To the world, he was still the golden heir. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and tense. Rows of wooden benches filled with curious onlookers, reporters with notepads, neighbors who had come to see the spectacle. At the front, the American flag hung steady, and the judge, a woman with steel gray hair and an expression carved from granite, took her seat. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. We stood, then sat as the trial began. Elaine Porter rose with the confidence of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire career. Her navy suit was crisp, her tone unwavering as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case is not about greed, it is about integrity." The late Richard Grant entrusted his son Marcus with a fortune, but he also entrusted him with responsibility to his family, specifically his sister Lydia Grant. Those conditions were clear. Marcus accepted them. And then, almost immediately, he broke them. Marcus's attorney, a polished man named Franklin, stood next. His words dripped with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a sibling dispute blown out of proportion. Marcus has provided for his sister generously. If he has been short with her, it is only natural given the stress of his new responsibilities. To strip him of his inheritance over a few petty disagreements would be unjust." I felt my stomach twist, but Elaine remained steady. She gestured toward me. "We will show that this was no petty disagreement. We will show willful exclusion, humiliation, and a deliberate attempt to erase Lydia from her own home in direct violation of Richard Grant's will." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Elaine called the first witness, a waiter from the engagement party. He shifted nervously in the stand, but spoke clearly. Mr. Grant seated Miss Lydia next to the staff station. When he gave his toast, he said, quote, "To keeping family gatherings free of embarrassment." Everyone understood he was talking about her. People laughed. She looked humiliated. Marcus shifted in his seat, his jaw clenching. Franklin objected, but the judge overruled. Then came the photographs. Elaine displayed them one by one on a projector, me pushed to the corner of the dining table. Marcus laughing as Natalie whispered in his ear, guests smirking in my direction. The images told a story more damning than words ever could. And then the recordings. Elaine pressed play, and Marcus's own voice filled the courtroom. "The will is a joke. All I have to do is tolerate Lydia's shadow in the house, and I'm 33 million richer." She's nothing more than a loose thread. Once Natalie and I marry, she'll be gone." Gasps rippled through the room. Natalie's face drained of color. Marcus shifted violently in his chair, muttering to Franklin, but the damage was done. Another recording played my confrontation with Marcus in the living room. His voice, low and mocking, echoed across the courtroom. "The will doesn't scare me, Lydia. Elaine doesn't scare me. You don't scare me. Do you really think anyone's going to take your word over mine?" Now it was not just my word. It was his word captured undeniable. Elaine turned to the judge, her voice like iron. "Evidence never blinks." Richard Grant's will was not a suggestion. It was a contract one Marcus agreed to. And by mocking it, by humiliating his sister, by declaring her unwelcome in her own home, he broke that contract. Under the law, the condition is clear: he forfeits the inheritance. Franklin tried to recover. He argued about context, about sibling banter, about exaggeration, but the judge raised a hand silencing him. Her gaze cut to Marcus, and for the first time his charm faltered. "Mr. Grant," the judge said, her tone cold, "you were entrusted not just with wealth, but with responsibility. Your arrogance blinded you to that responsibility. The evidence is overwhelming. By the authority vested in this court, I rule that you have violated the conditions of your father's will. Effective immediately, you forfeit the inheritance of $33 million. The gavel struck like thunder. For a moment, the room was silent, stunned. Then the murmurs began, reporters scribbling furiously, neighbors whispering, Natalie burying her face in her hands. Marcus sat frozen, his face drained of color, his lips pressed thin, as if holding back a scream. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. Justice had not just whispered, it had roared. My humiliation, my invisibility had been transformed into undeniable truth. Evidence had spoken louder than arrogance. The ruling spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, Marcus's downfall was front-page news. The headlines were merciless: heir loses $33 million. Fortune, after humiliating sister and evidence, never blinks. Judge strips Grant fortune. Neighbors whispered about it over coffee. Co-workers shared the story in hushed tones, and even strangers pointed when Marcus walked past them in the street. His name, once associated with charm and wealth, had become a punchline. The consequences came swiftly, each one striking like another blow. The first was the house. Elaine explained that under the terms of the will, the Grant estate reverted into a trust until a new executor could be appointed. Within days, the locks were changed, and Marcus was forced to pack his belongings under the watchful eyes of legal staff. The marble halls he had filled with music and laughter now echoed with silence as movers carried out boxes of suits, watches, and souvenirs from his life of excess. Then came the cars. Marcus had collected luxury vehicles like trophies, Bentleys, Porsches, a Lamborghini he had imported just months earlier. They were repossessed one by one, hauled away on flatbed trucks while photographers snapped pictures. The sight of Marcus standing in the driveway shouting at the tow operators while cameras clicked made the evening news. The footage replayed for days, a public unraveling of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. The financial institutions followed. Creditors who had extended Marcus generous lines of credit suddenly called in their debts. With his inheritance revoked, his accounts frozen, and his assets liquidated, Marcus discovered just how fragile his empire had been. The country club he adored revoked his membership. Invitations to charity galas vanished. Friends who had once toasted him stopped returning his calls. The golden boy had become a cautionary tale. Natalie, too, distanced herself. For a week after the ruling, she was seen at his side, offering brittle smiles to reporters, insisting they would weather this storm together. But the facade cracked quickly. One morning, Marcus woke to find her gone, her ring left on the kitchen counter. Within days, gossip columns reported her attending a fundraiser on the arm of another wealthy heir. The betrayal gutted him, but it was no surprise. Natalie had loved the fortune more than the man. The humiliation wasn't just financial or social. It was personal. Marcus couldn't walk into a restaurant without hearing whispers, couldn't open his phone without seeing his own smirk replayed in a courtroom clip mocking himself into ruin. The same arrogance he had worn like armor was now replayed endlessly as evidence of his downfall. He had become a symbol of greed, punished a story parents told their children as a warning. And yet, for all the chaos surrounding him, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility, the pain of being dismissed, belittled, erased. But now the truth stood taller than his arrogance. My father's words had been honored, his conditions had been enforced. Justice had come not in whispers but in thunder. Still, there was no joy in watching him crumble. I had dreamed of justice, yes, but not of seeing my brother hollowed out by shame. I remembered the boy he once was, before arrogance had poisoned him, the boy who had shared toys with me in the backyard, who had defended me once in middle school against a bully who had sat beside me at our father's knee. That boy was gone, consumed by greed, but the memory of him made the sight of his ruin sting in ways I hadn't expected. On the evening the last of his possessions were carried away, I stood by the window of the study watching Marcus climb into a taxi, his shoulders slumped, his suit wrinkled. The world outside jeered, but I remained silent. Justice had been done, but a part of me grieved too, not for the loss of his fortune, but for the brother I had lost long before the gavel ever struck. It was a week after the last of Marcus's belongings had been carried out of the house when he came back. The knock at the door was soft, hesitant, nothing like the confident slam of his hand against wood that I had grown used to. I opened it, and for a moment I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had once strutted in designer suits now stood before me in a wrinkled shirt, his tie loosened, his face unshaven. His eyes, those same eyes that had mocked me across dinner tables and glittering halls, looked hollow. "Lydia," he said, his voice rough, stripped of arrogance. "Please, can we talk?" For a long moment I said nothing. Memories of humiliation rushed back, the laughter of his friends. Natalie's smirk, his glass raised in a toast to my erasure. I almost closed the door. But something in his face, in the way his shoulders sagged, stopped me. I stepped aside. He entered, moving slowly like a man carrying chains no one else could see. We sat across from each other in the study, the room our father had loved most. Marcus's eyes darted to the empty desk, then back to me. He took a breath, but when he spoke, the words stumbled out. I never thought it would end like this. I thought I was untouchable. I thought money meant power. And now," his voice cracked and he rubbed his hand over his face, "now I have nothing." I leaned back, my hands folded in my lap. "You don't just have nothing, Marcus. You burned everything you did have. Respect, family, trust. You destroyed them with your own hands." He flinched, but he didn't argue. For once, he didn't have a quick retort, no smirk ready to cut me down. He only nodded, his eyes wet. "I know. God, I know. I should have listened. I should have treated you better. I should have honored Dad's words. I thought he left those conditions as a joke. I never realized they were a warning." He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "Lydia, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I am." The words hung between us, fragile and late. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that regret could erase years of cruelty. But scars do not vanish with apologies. I shook my head slowly. "Respect isn't inherited, Marcus," I said softly but firmly. "It's earned, and you spent your entire life throwing it away. Dad gave you a gift. He gave you wealth tied to responsibility. And instead of honoring it, you mocked me, and mocked his memory. You didn't just break the will, you broke him. You broke us." Tears slid down his cheeks, silent, unguarded. I had never seen my brother cry like that, not even when our father died. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. For a moment, I almost reached across the desk, almost offered the comfort I had spent a lifetime giving. But I stopped. I thought of every night I had sat alone, every whispered insult, every room I had been pushed out of. Comfort was not mine to give anymore. "Please," he whispered through his hands. I don't want to lose you too." I stood my chair, scraping against the floor. "Marcus, you lost me long before the money disappeared. You lost me when you decided I was less than you. You lost me when you chose cruelty over family. I can't give back what you've thrown away." He lifted his head, his eyes searching mine, desperate, broken. But I didn't falter. I turned toward the door, my voice steady. "You wanted to erase me. Now you know how it feels to be erased." He didn't follow me when I walked away. His sobs echoed softly in the study, filling the silence my father had once filled with wisdom. And in that moment, I realized the cruelest punishment was not the loss of $33 million. It was the weight of regret pressing down on him, regret that had arrived too late to save him. The house was quiet again after Marcus left, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of humiliation I had once felt. It was lighter now, as if the walls themselves exhaled. For the first time in years, the space felt like mine. I walked through the study, running my hand across the polished desk, and let myself imagine my father there, his eyes steady, his voice firm. I realized then that the conditions he had written into his will had not been a punishment for Marcus. They had been a lifeline for both of us. My father had known greed would devour my brother if it wasn't restrained. He had also known I would be invisible without something binding Marcus to see me. The inheritance was never really about money, it was about truth. And in the end, truth had spoken louder than arrogance. The newspapers soon moved on to other scandals, but neighbors never forgot. When they saw me in town, some would stop to say they admired my strength, others would whisper that justice had been done. I would smile politely, but inside I carried something deeper than vindication. I carried peace. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. I thought about the years I had spent chasing scraps of recognition, about the countless times I had swallowed pain just to keep peace. And I thought about the moment the judge's gavel fell, stripping Marcus of his fortune, restoring the balance my father had intended. Family, I realized, is not just about blood. Blood can betray. Family is about loyalty, respect, sacrifice returned with gratitude, not exploitation. My father had tried to teach us that lesson in life, and when Marcus refused to learn, he taught it in death through his will. I did not rejoice in Marcus's ruin. Watching his arrogance collapse into regret was painful in its own way. But justice is not always about joy. Sometimes it is about clarity, about showing the world what happens when pride blinds you, when cruelty replaces love. Marcus's wealth had vanished, his friends had scattered, his fiancée had abandoned him, but the harshest punishment was his own late awakening. He saw too late that what he thought was power had always been sand slipping through his fingers. As for me, I no longer felt invisible. I no longer felt like the shadow in my own story. I had stood in the light of truth, and it had held. My father's words would stay with me always. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned. To anyone who has ever felt erased, silenced, or overlooked in their own family, I say this: your worth is not measured by their blindness. It is measured by the truth you carry, the sacrifices you make, and the dignity you refuse to surrender. Betrayal can wound you, yes, but it can also sharpen you. And when justice finally arrives, it does more than punish, it restores. So if you are listening now and you have ever been cast aside by those who should have protected you, know that you are not alone. Comment below, share where you are watching from, and let your story be heard. Because here in this space, we are not shadows. We are voices. And voices like evidence never blink.